Okay, so you want to own a submarine. Not a boat, not a yacht. An actual submarine, the thing that disappears beneath the surface, drops past the reef, past the light, into total darkness, and then comes back up like it just visited another planet. The fantasy is simple. You buy the sub. You strap in. You sink beneath a coral wall while your friends watch from the deck of your yacht. You come back up 2 hours later having seen something almost nobody else on Earth has seen. It feels like the ultimate flex, the last toy left to buy once you already own the jet, the yacht, and the private island. The problem is that a submarine is not a toy that happens to go underwater. It is a life support capsule designed to survive an environment that is actively trying to crush it. And that single fact quietly rewrites the entire economics of owning one. Here's the first thing almost nobody understands about a submarine. A rocket is built to survive a vacuum pulling outward. A submarine is built to survive the opposite, water pressure pushing inward harder and harder the deeper you go. At 1,000 feet, the pressure on the hull is roughly 30 times what you feel at sea level. Get it wrong, even slightly, and the vessel does not leak. It collapses instantly in a fraction of a second. There is no slow failure mode. A submarine is one of the only vehicles on Earth where the difference between working perfectly and catastrophic loss of everyone aboard can come down to a few millimeters of material science. So before you even ask how a submarine makes money, you have to understand what you're actually buying. You're not buying a vehicle. You're buying a pressure vessel with a warranty against physics. Getting into this business, even as a private hobbyist, is not cheap. A basic 2- or 3-person leisure submersible from a serious manufacturer starts around $1 to $2 million, and that's before customization. Used submarines from established builders like Triton regularly change hands in the $3 million range. Push toward longer dive times, deeper depth ratings, or a 6- to 8-person cabin built into a superyacht's tender garage, and the number climbs into the tens of millions. Triton's fully certified, full ocean depth, submersible, the only civilian vessel rated to dive to the deepest point on the planet, sits in a category almost nobody can afford to enter. And that price tag is just the vessel. You also need a support vessel large enough to carry the crane that launches and recovers it. You need a trained pilot, because operating a submarine is nothing like driving a boat. You need annual inspection and recertification from a classification society, the marine equivalent of an aircraft's airworthiness check. You need insurance written by underwriters who understand exactly how expensive a mistake can be. None of this generates a single dollar of revenue. It is pure carrying cost, paid whether the submarine ever leaves the garage or not. Now here's where the story splits into two completely different businesses, because owning a submarine means something different depending on who's asking. If you're a billionaire buying a private sub as a yacht accessory, this is not a revenue-generating asset. It is a depreciating 6- to 8-figure toy that exists purely to be shown to dinner guests. It never earns its money back, and it isn't supposed to. That's one business, call it the impossible one. The other business is the one that actually has to make financial sense, the commercial passenger submarine. And that business has quietly existed profitably for almost 40 years. The obvious way a tourist submarine makes money is the ticket. A passenger pays somewhere between $100 and $200, climbs aboard a submarine that seats 48 or 64 people, and spends 45 minutes looking at a reef, a shipwreck, or an artificial reef built specifically for the tour. Multiply that by a full boat, several trips a day, and you get real revenue fast. A 64-passenger submarine running 4 trips a day at roughly $150 a seat is pushing close to $40,000 a day in ticket sales alone. That sounds enormous. But that number is misleading, because most of those tickets never actually come from the passenger's wallet directly. This is the part almost nobody thinks about. A huge share of tourist submarine revenue doesn't come from walk-up customers. It comes wholesale, through cruise lines and travel agents who buy blocks of seats at a discounted rate and resell them to their own passengers at a markup. The submarine operator collects a set net amount per seat. The cruise line keeps the difference as commission. One long-running Caribbean submarine operator built an entire side of its business around exactly this arrangement, selling tickets in bulk to major cruise lines, who then market the excursion to their own passengers under the ship's own shore excursion program. The submarine company never has to advertise to that customer at all. The cruise line does the marketing, the selling, and the customer acquisition in exchange for a cut of every seat. That's the hidden revenue engine. The submarine business isn't just selling dive tickets. It's selling wholesale seat inventory to a distribution network of cruise ships and resorts that already have direct access to millions of vacationing tourists. Once you understand that, the physical design of the whole experience starts to make sense. The dive route isn't random. It's built around whatever the most photogenic wreck or reef happens to be nearby. Sometimes an old ship, the company deliberately sank years earlier specifically to create a permanent underwater attraction. The narration is timed to peak right as the submarine passes the best viewpoint. Every passenger gets a souvenir dive log at the end, a small physical proof of the experience, because a person who paid $150 for 45 minutes underwater wants something to hold onto and something to post. None of that is decoration. Every part of the experience is engineered to convert a novelty ride into something a passenger will talk about, which is what keeps the wholesale channel valuable in the first place. Now flip to the cost side, because this is where the machine gets expensive fast. Submarines require constant maintenance on systems that have zero tolerance for failure. Battery banks, ballast systems, life support scrubbers, hull seals, viewport acrylics rated for repeated pressure cycling. Classification societies require regular hull inspections and recertification, and depending on the vessel's age and depth rating, that process alone can run into 6 figures. Insurance for a passenger-carrying submarine is not like insuring a tour bus. Underwriters price in the worst-case scenario, because there effectively is no minor accident category underwater. Crew have to be specially trained and, in many jurisdictions, certified separately from standard maritime crews. And all of this is fixed cost. The battery still needs maintaining, and the hull still needs recertifying whether the submarine carries 64 passengers that day or 6. That mismatch, a huge, unavoidable maintenance and certification bill sitting underneath a revenue stream that can dry up the moment tourism slows down, is survivable for an established operator with decades of cash reserves and a diversified customer base. It is not survivable for a small operator trying to break into the industry on a tight budget. Which brings us to the hidden trap sitting underneath this entire industry. The temptation to save money on the one category of cost where saving money is the most dangerous thing you can do, the pressure hull itself. For decades, every commercial passenger submarine was built with a solid metal hull, typically titanium, and every one of them went through rigorous third-party classification before ever carrying a paying customer. That process is slow and expensive. It's also the only real proof, other than the vessel simply not imploding, that the design can survive the pressure it's rated for. In 2009, a company called OceanGate was founded with a mission of opening up deep ocean access to more people. It started conventionally enough, using a steel-hulled submersible for tourist dives off the California coast. But building deeper diving, metal-hulled submersibles is enormously expensive. So OceanGate's founder made a different choice. Instead of an all-titanium pressure hull, the company built its new submersible, eventually named Titan, out of a carbon fiber composite wound around titanium end caps. A design nobody had ever used for a crude, deep-diving submersible, because carbon fiber behaves unpredictably under repeated compression in a way titanium does not. And rather than submit the finished vessel to third-party classification, the company chose not to certify it at all, arguing that outside oversight would slow down innovation. The vessel took paying passengers to the Titanic wreck starting in 2021, initially for just over $100,000 a seat. In 2019, before those trips even began, an outside submersible expert on a test dive heard cracking sounds from the hull and warned that the material appeared to be failing. The dives continued. In 2022, the hull was rebuilt after the original developed fatigue damage. That same year, on a dive that reached the Titanic wreck, the crew and monitoring systems recorded a loud acoustic event as the vessel ascended, later understood to be the carbon fiber delaminating internally. The dives continued. By then, the ticket price had risen to $250,000 a seat. On June 18, 2023, Titan descended toward the Titanic wreck with 5 people aboard. Contact was lost less than 2 hours in. 4 days of international search effort followed before debris was found on the seafloor, roughly 1,600 feet from the Titanic itself. The vessel had imploded during descent, killing everyone aboard instantly. A U.S. Coast Guard investigation, completed 2 years later, concluded the disaster was entirely preventable and pointed to inadequate design, inadequate certification, and a workplace culture that suppressed engineers' safety concerns in favor of moving faster and spending less. OceanGate shut down within weeks of the disaster. The lesson underneath that story isn't that one company made one bad decision. It's that a submarine has almost no room for the kind of cost-cutting that works in nearly every other industry. In a restaurant, cutting a corner might mean a slightly worse dining experience. In a submarine, cutting the one corner that exists specifically to catch a flawed hull before it's ever loaded with paying customers removes the only safeguard standing between normal operation and total loss. Compare that to a very different kind of failure. In the 2010s, Richard Branson publicly announced an ambitious project to build a submarine capable of reaching the deepest point of every ocean on Earth. The project generated enormous press attention and excitement. Years later, it was quietly shelved, not because anything failed underwater, but because the engineering, certification, and cost realities of building a vehicle to survive full ocean depth turned out to be far larger than the initial vision accounted for. No one died. No headlines followed the cancellation the way they'd followed the announcement. The project simply became too expensive to finish responsibly, and the company walked away rather than cut the corners that OceanGate did not. 2 failures, One killed 5 people because the safety margin was treated as optional. The other cost an investor his money and his pride because the safety margin was treated as non-negotiable. In an industry where the cost of getting it wrong is measured in human lives, the second kind of failure is the one you want to be capable of. So what does success actually look like in this business? It looks almost boring by comparison. One Cayman Islands-based operator has been running commercial passenger submarines since 1985, using titanium hulls, full classification certification, and Coast Guard oversight everywhere it operates in U.S. waters. 4 decades later, that same company operates more than a dozen submarines across the Caribbean, the Pacific, and Hawaii, has completed more than 500,000 dives, and has carried upward of 18 million paying passengers without a single hull failure. There's no headline-grabbing innovation in that story. That's exactly the point. The entire business model is built on being unremarkable, predictable, and certified, dive after dive, for 40 straight years. Scale is what makes that math work. A single submarine at a single location is financially fragile. One slow tourist season, one hurricane, one maintenance surprise, and the fixed costs eat the entire year's margin. But a company running a dozen submarines across 8 countries spreads its certification expertise, its maintenance crews, its insurance relationships, and its cruise line partnerships across every location at once. A hull inspection process refined in Hawaii gets reused in Barbados. A wholesale ticketing relationship built with one cruise line gets extended to every port that line visits. At small scale, the safety and certification overhead is a crushing fixed cost. At large scale, it becomes a competitive moat, because no small startup can absorb 4 decades of accumulated safety data and cruise line trust overnight. The future of this industry is being shaped, unavoidably, by the very disaster that could have destroyed public interest in it. Deep ocean tourism searches and bookings actually rose in the years following the Titan implosion, driven by a mix of morbid curiosity and renewed public fascination with the deep ocean. At the same time, regulators worldwide are moving toward tighter oversight of experimental, uncertified submersibles, which will likely make it harder for the next OceanGate to exist, while doing little to change the economics for operators who were already fully certified. On the private ownership side, demand from the ultra-wealthy keeps climbing, with manufacturers now building custom 8-seat submarines integrated directly into new superyacht designs, sold explicitly as a status symbol rather than an investment. So does owning a submarine actually make financial sense? It depends entirely on which submarine you're asking about. As a private toy bolted to the back of a superyacht, the answer is simple: no, and it was never supposed to. It is a 7-figure depreciating asset that exists purely to be experienced and shown off, funded by people for whom the return on investment was never the point. As a single commercial submarine run by a small operator, the answer is uncertain at best. The fixed costs of certification, maintenance, and insurance sit dangerously close to the revenue a small tourist market can generate, and one bad season can be fatal. But at real scale, run by an operator with decades of safety data, cruise line distribution relationships, and a fleet large enough to absorb the fixed costs of doing this safely, a passenger submarine is one of the most quietly durable tourism businesses on Earth. Profitable, repeatable, and remarkably boring in exactly the way an industry built around crushed depth should be. So if you do decide to own a submarine, understand what you're actually buying. You are not buying a vehicle. You are buying trust. Trust in a hull, trust in a certification process, trust in every engineer who chose the slow, expensive, unglamorous path over the fast one. In an industry where the ocean does not forgive shortcuts, that trust is the only asset that was ever really for sale.